Hello, class. Here are my responses to the discussion questions at the end of Chapter 2. The first question dealt with this issue of what ways have changes in the social, economic, political environment been reflected in corrections. Well, I think these changes that we see in corrections are an extension of a broader change in these domains with a greater emphasis on science and rationality throughout many of our social institutions. In the case of medicine and government and even warfare, we see increasing involvement in the sciences and just rational thought, and corrections were no exception here. So we have, for instance, the Eighth Amendment that forbid cruel and unusual punishments, and although this was thought to be part of a humanitarian revolution that we would not want to make an individual suffer unnecessarily, it also is irrational to do so in some cases because it can backfire if the punishment does not fit the crime. So kind of undercutting the rationalist approach to punishment. We also can see this in the medicalization of crime and criminality, and corrections and criminal justice generally seen not just as punishment, but as a kind of a treatment, like a medicine for the crimes and the criminals that commit them. And that's some of my thoughts on that anyway. Second question is, how did these developments bring about the separation of children from others in the prison system? Well, there was, over the course of the late medieval period up and through the 20th century, there was just this growing recognition that children are simply not smaller-bodied adults, that the psychology of a child is different from the psychology of an adolescent, which is in turn different from the psychology of a grown adult. And what we see happening really is the integration of what we know today to be developmental psychology into law and legal practices. So we know, for instance, that adolescents, the way that their brain works is that the limbic system, or the emotional core of the brain, plays a much greater role in their decision making as compared to adults. That as adults, we get better at self-control, as some criminologists like to call it. Because that acknowledgement was important. It was a several centuries long process. But yeah, children used to be seen as just smaller bodied adults. Their brains, their minds were just seen as well, a non-issue, really. Thirdly, how have the interests of administrators and organizations distorted the ideals of penal reforms? I'm not sure what you all put, but many ways to answer this. One of the ways that can distort the ideals of penal reforms is just simply budgetary concerns that may conflict with rehabilitative goals. And so you may really have it in your heart of hearts that you want to rehabilitate, but this will cost money because you have to hire specialists and you have to have special programs and the space and other resources to do this. So that can quite easily, as you might imagine, undercut any real rehabilitative goals or the kind of loftier goals of penal reforms. And the fourth question that I responded to, the fifth one, seemed to me kind of a reiteration of several themes running throughout this set of questions. But in the fourth one, the question was, has there been a continuous movement towards more humane treatment of convicted people? Well, in some respects, certainly. There is far less emphasis of punishing the body, with exception of maybe putting people in solitary confinement. You could say that's a kind of punishment of the body, or certainly the death penalty. So we don't torture people as a way of punishing them anymore, and the use of the death penalty itself has been extremely limited now to just one offense, really. It's premeditated murder with malice aforethought and sadistic intentions going on there. However, one might argue is that why it may not be a smooth road towards more humane treatment is that the growth of the criminal justice system has in turn netted a larger proportion of the population than what would occur in history. And so clearly with the war on drugs, a larger proportion of the population being arrested for using intoxicating substances, which I think all of you can probably see how that had a net widening effect. But also with Child Protective Services, what went on in the home, what went on in the domestic sphere for much of Western history, and this is probably true of other cultures, this was outside of the purview of legal authorities. And so this certainly includes the treatment of children, but also domestic violence between spouses, that this was something that was not seen until about the mid part of the 20th century as something that the law should do something about. And so in turn you get people arrested for domestic violence, their children taken away from them, and this has had this net widening effect. And so some of you might think, well, that is more humane. We can't have people abusing their spouses and abusing their children, but we might question the wisdom of locking someone up for doing so, and then the children are no better as a result. Okay, so yeah, overall, I think we would be much better punished in this century as opposed to previous centuries. But it's not as if this is without any concern with regard to mass incarceration. This is net widening effect. Whenever you have a larger bureaucracy, it's almost like a force of nature. It's going to swallow up more people because the bureaucracy can swallow up more people because it's bigger. Okay, folks, hope this was helpful. Until next time, bye-bye.